Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. This is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers all things in what used to be known as the global war on terror, but we now call the Long War. Today, we have, a very special guest returning. Always great to have my friend and colleague, Thomas Joscelyn, back on Generation Jihad. Tom, of course, is the co-founder of Generation Jihad, my longtime partner in crime and tracking Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, Taliban, state sponsors like Iran and Pakistan, state sponsors of terrorism, that is. Tom is a senior fellow at Just Security. Tom, welcome back to Generation Jihad. Always a pleasure.
Thanks, Bill. I mean, I don't know how special it is. I mean, if I keep coming on, I guess, and we have this reunion tour, I mean, maybe that's special for people. I don't know.
It's special to me.
I enjoy it anyway.
Listen, I got to pump you up. But no, it is. It's great to have you back on and to cover these issues. Today, we're going to talk about General Miller, the last commander of Resolute Support Mission in Afghanistan. He testified to Congress. It was one of those long form testimonies, question and answer session, to the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and some pretty interesting things in there. You know, I guess, Tom, we're sort of kicking off our Afghanistan, how would you put it, autopsy. You know, we had Zalmay Khalilzad, of course, the special representative for Afghanistan reconstruction, reconciliation. Yeah. And the architect.
No irony loaded in that title.
Yeah. Right. Never was a reconciliation. That alone should tell you just how failed his mission was. And then General Miller's comments, I believe it was a month or so ago, he testified to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Again, probably testified for like 9-10 hours, over 200 pages of testimony to go through. But a lot of relevance to, you know, it's interesting to get his view. Look, Tom and I, we were critical of Zalmay Khalilzad, we were critical of General Miller and of the entire multiple administrations and the efforts to withdraw from Afghanistan. General Miller certainly played a central role in that. Although I would think, it's funny, Tom, maybe you would agree with this. When you read his testimony, he's acting like he was just sort of a soldier here. He comes, he'll say several times, I'll make my recommendations and I'll put them up the chain of command, but my job was to execute orders. And I thought that was a little bit of a cop out from him. But what's your thoughts on that, Tom? I mean, your thoughts on the general testimony as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean,
get into details.
General Scott Miller, I mean, we're going to talk about his comments about our work and our criticisms, too, in a second. But I mean, look, I read the transcript. I think generally I read it as candid. I don't, sometimes you read transcripts from current or former officials and you're like, oh, this guy's just full of it. Right. And I don't get that sense from General Scott Miller. I mean, I think he's being candid. I think there were a number of times in the transcript where he said he wanted to speak and wanted to answer a question, even if it, may have infringed on executive privilege or other problems, and I give him credit for that. And I think he wanted to be candid. And I think some of his answers, rung true for me, and we can get into that. But I think, when I see the sort of what you're talking about, the dynamic you're talking about, Bill, I think the problem for me there is that if you are saying you're acting under orders, which he was, and as we talked last time I was on the podcast, 3 different presidents in a row wanted to get out of Afghanistan, and that's really the context in which all these guys, whether they're military command or diplomats or others, are operating. But if you're operating under those orders and under that command, and what you see on the ground is completely inconsistent with those orders, or it does not make sense, right?
Or those orders are going to fail. Like they're certain, going to fail. Exactly. Which he pretty much indicates throughout that he was certain.
Right.
This wouldn't work.
Then isn't it incumbent upon you to say something, to stand up and to stick your neck out? I mean, I think that's kind of what we should expect from leaders anywhere across the society, And the thing is that, when I read his testimony, it seemed to me like he knew, or claims that he knew, that certain policies that were being pursued were destined to fail and were inconsistent with the reality as he knew it. But it doesn't seem like he said much of anything at the time about this. And he would talk about his limited. Now, again, I don't want to put all that on him. I mean, I think, if you read the transcript carefully, for example, when the Biden administration comes in, General Miller is locked out of the interagency process, right? I mean, it just tells you how messed up this whole thing is, that the last general of Resolute Support, the last, boots on the ground commander of American forces in Afghanistan, isn't even being consulted or taught or discussing these issues in interagency process with the National Security Council and others in government. I mean, that's messed up, right? So you have to right away understand that his ability to affect change, in terms of how policymakers see it and how the politicos back in Washington see it, is limited, right? Be that as it may, I think, if I were in his shoes, I would hope that I would have said more about the futility and the obvious flaws in the policies that I was being asked to execute, and oversee, and that includes something like, for example, the idea that you're going to get a political settlement or negotiations with the Taliban are going to result in something other than the Taliban's stated desire to resurrect an Islamic emirate. And, Bill, you and I flogged that for years, that whole idea that they were going to get a political settlement with the Taliban. It didn't make any sense. And, I thought, for example, General Miller is asked, and to his credit, unlike a lot of other people, he's asked, did you assess, they cite one of your articles, Bill, I think it's from 2020 or something like that, about the Taliban.
You're talking about the one from 2016 where the Taliban said,
I don't know, there's so many of them, Bill.
Yeah, no, I think it's the one where basically the Taliban said they weren't going to settle on silly ministerial posts.
Yeah, maybe it was that one.
Share power. I think that's the one.
Yeah, there's so many of them. I mean, but anyway, he's asked about one of them about how, do you agree that the Taliban's goal, as long as you were, fighting the war and everything, and in terms of your experience, was to resurrect the Islamic Emirate? He says, absolutely. Yes, he understood that was goal. And, there were a lot of people who were delusional about that in the policymaking chain, who pretended that the Taliban was about something other than that. However, he's also asked about the negotiations with the Taliban and says that the only way this can really end is through a political settlement. But a political settlement would require the Taliban to, in effect, completely break with their long-standing ideological goal, which General Miller recognizes, of resurrecting the Islamic Emirate. The Islamic Emirate is a totalitarian regime, right? There is no political settlement in the Islamic Emirate. The Islamic Emirate is only going to have a settlement within itself in terms of which Taliban leaders get power. That's it. There's not going to be a reckoning or some sort of desire to raise something other than a theocracy in Afghanistan. And so that's the type of thing where I think, saying something in real time, would have been useful.
Yeah, Tom, I absolutely agree with your observations. I'm sure that's no shock to you or our listeners. I mean, we've essentially shared the brain on this issue for almost 2 decades now.
Yeah.
Particularly on negotiations and whatnot, or the efficacy of negotiating with the Taliban. I agree with you. I believe he was being very candid during this. I think he was being sincere. And at times I felt you could sense he was remorseful, or I felt a lot of regret from that testimony. You could see the loss of Afghanistan hurt him personally. I'm not as critical of General Miller with his time during the Biden administration, because as you noted, he was shut out. And he's very clear about that in multiple times to the testimony, that he had access to Secretary Pompeo. He had access to the Chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Trump administration, but during the Biden administration, he was stovepiped. He had to report to General McKenzie, the CENTCOM commander, who then reported up to General Miller, then reported up to the president. He'll tell you he had almost zero input directly on that process of whether the withdrawal should happen, and then post withdrawal what should happen. So yeah, that's I thought that was very interesting, but
I guess what I would say is that when he did have access, though, like during
that's where the criticism lies. I'm like,
right. When he did
you outlined that perfectly.
Yeah, he should have said more about his objection. The contradiction between the Taliban's ever long-standing goal of resurrecting the Islamic Emirate and the Trump administration's policy of producing a political settlement or pursuing a political settlement should have been obvious to everybody, including him. That those two things cannot be reconciled. And I mean, he talks about going with Khalilzad, Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad at one point to try and find somebody to negotiate with the Taliban, somebody who was a real power broker of the Taliban. And I just thought that type of testimony is the type of thing, as a New Yorker who in the past was involved in the business world, when one side is desperate to negotiate with the other, that's usually not a good thing for the side that's desperate to negotiate, right? It usually tells you that you're negotiating out of weakness and that you're ripe to be taken advantage of. And effectively, when you read his transcript, I think that comes across. I mean, he says the Taliban was very eager to negotiate with the U.S. Right. Why? in the end. Why were they negotiating? Because they fleeced us. They fleeced the U.S. They got exactly what they wanted, right? I mean, it's one of those cases where if you're a diplomat involved in this type of stuff, I would love to contact you today and sell you a bridge in the New York area. I'm offering it for a very, very low price. I guarantee you. So I mean, it's that type of. That's why. And again, when he had, I don't know what exactly he said during the Trump administration, if anything, up the chain of command, and some of that stuff is obviously going to be private. But some more. I think that the U.S. military leadership did not do a good job or any of explaining just how inconsistent these policies were with the reality on the ground.
Yeah, and General Miller, not only if he had been silent and just sort of followed orders under the Trump administration, maybe I could excuse that. I would still argue that in his position, he should be vocal, but he was vocal in support of negotiations. He said publicly that, that the negotiations were the solution to Afghanistan. And as you noted, Tom,
and they were for the Taliban.
Right. I really wish that he was asked, did he think the Taliban were negotiating from a position of strength or a position of weakness? Like, that is a question that this committee did not ask. And I would have been very curious to see what his response to that was. And that gets to the next, so I think, Tom, you and I, we were both surprised to see this in his testimony. He is asked about an article that you wrote, I believe, for the Dispatch in 2021, right?
June of 2021, right?
21, yeah. So this was in
2021.
And referring to the work that both you and I had done on the security situation in Afghanistan and the district.
Relying heavily on your analysis of the districts.
It was our analysis, Tom. We collaborated a lot on a lot of things. And and your article was, just excellent, explained how General Milley basically, got it wrong. I think I forget the point in time, but it was sometime in mid to late June. He had said, the Taliban had only gained control of a couple of districts. There's only 60 districts under Taliban control, 60 or 70. And I was reporting it was about 150 under Taliban control. And this was being documented. Again, that reporting was pulled from press reports, from Afghan sources, from what the Taliban was claiming. And it was pretty consistent.
Yeah, we were doing an all source analysis, and the title of that article, just because we like to be blunt, was "The situation in Afghanistan is much worse than you realize," right? And it said that this thing is falling, and it's falling faster than the U.S. military is claiming. That was our analysis, and it basically was, you read it and you have to wonder, why was the U.S. military so out to lunch in terms of understanding how fast this was going,
Yeah. And, in that, he's questioned about that article. He says he's aware of it. He says, I'll quote from it. He says, Bill and Tom Joscelyn, quote, Bill and Tom Joscelyn really, were pulling this apart district by district, and we were too, in some of our reporting as we were going along there. But I didn't disagree. And then later he says, they had it right. Again, that also in quotes. So I thought that was an interesting piece of information and recognition for us. We don't often get that. But it's interesting. At the time, there was a lot of criticism for what we were doing on explaining the security situation. And as you noted in your article at the Dispatch, General Milley was getting it completely wrong. And where was he getting that information? I wish he was, again, I would like to have seen Foreign Affairs press harder. Well, how did General Milley get that information? Of course, General Miller would probably say, well, I told them this, and I don't know how they're reporting that. But
yeah, Miller actually says I wasn't briefing Milley on any of this, so I'm not briefing him on his testimony. So
who was?
Right.
That's what doesn't make sense here. And so, how did he know this? How could he have seen the security situation as we saw it at the time? And yet, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is saying something completely different. We didn't get an answer to that, but it was, I guess, professionally satisfying to see General Miller, give us credit for it. Any thoughts you have on that, Tom?
Yeah, I wish we were wrong, right? It's not about
absolutely always
not about being right, it's about getting it right. But I wish in this case we were wrong. It's just the problem, our sense of frustration in doing this type of work is that, the process that you and I go through, it's quite obvious that a lot of other stakeholders all the stakeholders were not going through when it came to Afghanistan, right? Like for example, that the full quote from General Miller is that you and I were antagonistic to the military commanders, right? We're not antagonistic to military commanders, like, like the Taliban apologists are. We're antagonistic to bullshit, right? I mean, that's the problem. If you're spinning a bunch of nonsense, right? If you're not telling the truth, and if what you're saying is obviously disproven, and you will not rely on facts that show, you won't acknowledge facts that contradict, what you're saying, then there's a problem. There's a big problem, And Bill, you had written a number of times articles. I think the first one was 2019, I think, when the US military stopped producing district data, right, on the districts that were, under control or threatened by the Taliban and its allies, and Al-Qaeda allies. And, this is exactly what we mean, right? These data were inconvenient for what the military was peddling and what the State Department and other people in Washington wanted to believe. And so instead of continuing up with the reporting, they just stopped releasing it, Now, and there was some, nonsense statement was put out at the time about how, this isn't really indicative of what's going on, and it's all about the peace process and this and that. And you and I looked at that and then said game over. There was one of the many times we said game over. This showed that in reality they weren't really contesting to try and keep Afghanistan together or to prevent the Taliban from winning. They were just desperately seeking this fanciful peace process. And that's the type of thing that when you see that type of thing, that's what causes what General Miller will call antagonism. I would just call it friendly criticism, right? I mean, if you're really confident in what you're saying and you really believe what you're saying to be true, then iron sharpens iron, right? You should be able to either get it right, show that we're wrong, or get your own analysis and make it better, right? And the problem that we saw a lot of times when it came to the war in Afghanistan is that none of the stakeholders did that. They just sort of played hide the ball with inconvenient facts and everything else. And it wasn't just, you said the outside bill that we were critical of the withdrawal. We were critical of everything, right? The war fighting, the decision making, the whole thing, right? I mean, we had criticisms of everything. That wasn't antagonistic. It was critical because they couldn't give us good answers to our criticisms, right? They didn't have good answers to say we were wrong. Instead, they didn't really want to hear what we had to say. And so, well, that's why I wish we had been wrong, because the result is exactly what we predicted.
Yeah. Tom, if we were doing work, and look, our work, I know they were aware of our work, right? We were never asked to consult one single time. Honestly, it doesn't bother me, but it only bothers me in the sense that, like, hey, maybe they could have, I started doing this, I think in 2013 or 14, started the map, because I recognized that there might be a problem here. And I put it out there to try to explain, hey, we have a problem. Maybe you need to be adjusting your strategy and adjusting your tactics and dealing with the actual Taliban strategy, and not, pigeonholing ourselves into our own strategy without recognizing the enemy's strategy. But instead, it was treated as if we were problematic. Look, and you had mentioned that when he discontinued the district reporting in 2019, General Miller did that. Here's what he said at the time, quote, "of limited decision-making value," end quote. And then he also said that the entire goal was, quote, "a political settlement," end quote.
There you go.
General Nicholson.
I was recalling it off the top of my head. That is what I remembered him saying. I remembered him saying something like that at the time. And you and I looked at that quote and said, "Game over, bud. You don't get it. And there you go."
What did he tell us, Tom? He told us what's happening in the districts doesn't matter, but then he tells us in testimony that, yeah, we were tracking this. This is a big deal.
And then it did matter. Yeah.
Right. And then he's telling us a political settlement is the answer, when he knows that the Taliban's ultimate goal was the reestablishment of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which you noted at the outset. That's the inconsistencies here. And how does that make, the antagonistic, and I am going to again read directly from that, because I do think it's important. It's just really galling to see that happen. Let me pull up the quote here. Sorry about that. He says, and here's what he says, quote, "And, I'm not, close to either of these two writers," that's Tom and I. "They were unusually antagonistic, to all the military commanders out there, but they had it right," end quote. What military commanders were we antagonistic to out there? I mean, if anyone had ever asked us questions, we would have answered them gladly. Our goal was to help. But I think this just, this does show. He says in his testimony to Congress, Tom, as well, that he's very thick-skinned. I thought that was a very thin-skinned comment from him, that antagonistic comment.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of what I think, our experience with, again, unlike a lot of the other people who were doing this, supposedly doing this kind of work, you and I didn't consult the U.S. military or any of these agencies on any of this stuff, right? And the bottom line is that our experience when we report something that was common sense based on the facts, it was actually the military leadership or analysts for the military leadership who were carrying their water who were antagonistic toward us, right? Or people in the counterterrorism community who didn't want to hear that, Al Qaeda hadn't been completely vanquished down to the last individual in Afghanistan, right? They were antagonistic to us. And I mean, again, that's because, if you're that thin-skinned that basic facts rankle you and mean that you can't handle what's going on and you can't handle inconvenient facts like that, then maybe your own analysis, maybe your own perceptions of things are wrong, And that's the thing that I think, a lot of people don't get is that, again, it's about getting it right, not being right. And a lot of what you and I have talked about is, and this is part of our concern about war fighting going forward and how America conducts foreign policy and does all these things, without the lack of true accountability and plumbing exactly how this went wrong and the many ways it went wrong and how many errant decisions were made. And I have no hope that any of that will be done, by the way, by the Afghan War Commission or anything else.
Well, because members of that commission were directly involved in this, and you really think they're going to implicate themselves?
I think one of them was even critical of your map in the long run.
Exactly. Absolutely.
It's the type of nonsense you got to deal with here, So people who were part of the system that got it wrong, I think there's one or two.
Tom, can I share a quick? I think I may have told you this. That individual who was critical of it, very critical of it at the time, later wrote an article and asked me to use the map in an analysis to show that I was right. It was one of the most bizarre things, and but didn't have the courage to ask me directly. Had to ask through his editor.
Yeah, I mean, enough. This whole system was rotten. And there's one good person on the commission, but the rest of it I don't really have any hope for. And it just, to me, and the reason why I bring it up again, I think I brought it up the last time we were here too, is that I called for independent accountability the last time I testified for the Senate Armed Services Committee in 2021. You and I have called for it many, many times. It's something that needs to be done. But to really do it, you got to have outsiders who are being intellectually honest, who are going to really plumb all the mistakes and all the rotten decisions and not carry water for anybody. I just don't have any hope that that's going to be done. And that's what leads to, because people aren't invested in getting it right, I don't have hope that they're going to get it right in the future, right? Because we don't really learn from these mistakes.
Absolutely not. You have a general who served in Afghanistan, and I believe he was a member of the staff intelligence officer. You've had analysts who directly consulted for the U.S. government, served as advisors, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I'm going to expect them to take apart their own work, and that of those who they rely on for patronage. We're not going to get an answer on what happened with Afghanistan. The House Foreign Affairs Committee, the current committee is really looking at the withdrawal itself, and that's fine. I certainly wish it had been more expansive and looking further back to the problems. I think there's been some good work done. I think the generals have gotten off easy. The military, there's been a lot of, I think maybe we'll talk about that next. A lot of kicking the can down to state. Miller testifies a lot about the state, his relationship with State Department and the State Department's role. Tell us about that, Tom.
Well, I think, again, he was a partner with the State Department in trying to find this political settlement and didn't recognize the fundamental contradiction and didn't understand that the enemy was not really interested in a political settlement at all and was just going to use diplomacy to achieve its military ends, right? The Taliban, one of the mantra that you criticize so often, Bill, was that the U.S. military would say there's no military solution to Afghanistan. Well, the Taliban had a military solution for Afghanistan, and actually part of their military solution was using diplomacy to weaken its ultimate adversary, which was the Afghan government. And they executed that perfectly because so many people in the State Department, and it turns out military leadership were willing accomplices in that regard. But he talks about the State Department, and so you should note at the front that he was invested in those efforts too, even though it was a fool's errand as far as we were concerned, and even worse than that. But he does some of his testimony when it comes to the State Department's cavalier attitude. At first thinking that they're going to have an embassy in Kabul, long term, and that they didn't even need military protection for it, and this was out there. I mean, this is really unhinged from reality. But it goes to show just how much the servile diplomacy with the Taliban had taken root. That basically U.S. government stakeholders no longer understood that America was not going to be welcome in the Taliban's Afghanistan, and that these talks in Doha had achieved the Taliban's military goal of winning the war, and they really meant Yankee get out. They weren't here to have afternoon tea with somebody in the diplomatic attaché from the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. That wasn't going to happen, right? It was over. And so, his criticism in that regard of the State Department strike me as legitimate and on point, and is consistent with what you and I were hearing, is that a lot of the policymaking, a lot of the reasons why the withdrawal was so disastrous was that there was this misgotten belief that the U.S. was going to have a longstanding diplomatic presence in Kabul, even, going forward. And of course, that was never realistic.
No, it wasn't. Yeah, it's really interesting. This is where he needed to, at some point, be more vocal about this, insist on getting, in the room with the actual decision makers, because, what you get from his testimony is he knew this was an absolute mistake to try to maintain an embassy, which would, by the way, involve military personnel, which, assuming if he had maintained, he would be responsible, or his successor would be responsible for, endangering the lives of not just the embassy personnel, but of the soldiers or the Marines who would be left behind to protect them. I do think this is where he needed to be a little bit more forceful. I get back to, I guess this isn't directly related to state, but it's back to the accountability issue, right? No one, not a single general or a member of State Department stood up and just said, this is not feasible. We can't do this. I have to resign in protest. There's just no courage there. But I do think he was very candid, and it comports with, what we observed about his criticisms of the State Department. The State Department seemed wholly unprepared to call the NEA, or the non-combatant evacuation order. He said there wasn't planning. They planned it on the fly. It was called way too late. I can't remember, Tom. Do you remember? He said he thought it should have been called sometime in July, if I recall, something like mid to late, somewhere around when he left. And that, by the way, that's another thing he wasn't questioned on too. Why did he leave when he left? We never got an explanation from him about that. But so we do have to remember he did relinquish command in mid-July. So anything that happened after then, he's very clear in his testimony that he was, an outside observer at that point.
Yeah, and reading the transcript, you feel for him, right? I mean, he's talking about how he's powerless and he's getting calls and he can't do anything, and I sympathize with him on all that. I think he mentions his son at one point, even, who has the same name, is getting calls, and it just, all that hits home. That's all rough stuff to have to deal with, and I'm sure there's still a lot of trauma. I know for a fact there's a lot of trauma with U.S. service members who served in Afghanistan, and are wondering what it was all for. Given the outcome, given how it transpired, and given the disastrous withdrawal under President Biden. I think that's all. That's all still very much in play, and I don't know that that's going to be resolved anytime soon. But I think, to your point, Bill, about the committee is very focused on the actual last act of the last. The very last scene in the last act of this play, right? They don't want to really get into anything that came before it. I mean, yeah, President Biden and his administration own the last scene of the last act. They own the disaster withdrawal. There's a lot that could have been done differently that you and I have discussed ad nauseum in the past. But it is also true that last scene, that last act, was set up by the previous administration and even the administration before it, and even the administration before that. There are tracks here that go further back in time that you have to understand, and to understand how you ended up there, right? And it goes back to, the U.S. did not need to lock itself into this servile position with the Taliban, as it did, under the Trump administration in particular, in terms of trying to negotiate this farcical deal with the Taliban. Didn't need to do that, and ultimately that track is what leads to what happened in August. Now, President Biden could have gone on another track, right? He could have gotten off that track. He could have done something differently. His administration could have done something differently. But, we know he didn't really have any interest in even considering any of that. I mean, this is a guy who can't really spell Afghanistan after all these years. So
that was incredible, Tom. Explain that, because I think that went over a lot of people's heads. You had mentioned that before, but go ahead.
Well, it turns out in the Her report, which was this investigation of President Biden's mishandling of classified documents, that he apparently misspells Afghanistan in the same way. I think he leaves out the H, I guess it is, in Afghanistan, right? And so one of the reasons they knew that certain things were handwritten by him was because he misspelled it the same way for years and years and years and years. And I just, I saw that and I thought, God help us. I mean, this is what's the decision making that's going on.
Yeah.
I mean,
I don't mean to be critical on one point, but when you went in totality, right? It just, it speaks volumes.
I mean, look, we've talked about this for hours and hours and hours, Bill, right? Hours and hours and hours. We talked about this. I think you could just break it down to that, right? The commander in chief that oversaw the final withdrawal. This is how the U.S. leadership and commander in chiefs across 3 different administrations and the people who really had the power to change things, right? Or do things differently anyway. They really weren't invested in this, right? They weren't really interested in this. They just wanted to get out. And that's why you and I said very early on, I mean, it's one of the canards and all this, or one of the false dichotomies people have. Well, if we didn't do this deal with the Taliban, we had to stay indefinitely or do this or that. And it's, we've argued over and over again, going right back to the Trump years, and even back to the Obama years.
So the Obama, I was going to say,
right?
Yeah.
Just if just get out. If you don't want to be there and you don't know what you're doing, and why bend the knee to the Taliban on the way out, and General Miller does talk about how, the Afghan officials didn't believe we were leaving, and I credit that. I don't think the Afghan officials did believe we were leaving. And that the problem there, right, is that there was never any setting the stage for America leaving that said you have to fight this. Basically, you have to come up with leadership on your own and figure out a way to fight this on your own. And maybe you're still going to lose. But, if Ashraf Ghani isn't the guy and your current chain of command isn't working, or there needs to be some sort of reordering here on the Afghan side, you guys need to figure that out and figure out how to take this brass knuckle fight to the Taliban, because we can't do it for you forever, and that's part of the problem with not setting the stage earlier for a withdrawal, right? For not leaving earlier. Like if the U.S. government had decided years earlier we're going to negotiate the withdrawal, not with the Taliban, who's our enemy and is harboring Al Qaeda and intertwined with Al Qaeda, which we can end this segment. I would say this episode on in a second. Instead of doing that, why don't we negotiate with the Afghan government what contractor support would look like, what these types of things will look like? But we are not going to put Americans in the line of, we're not going to put them out in the field in a way they can be harmed anymore, right? We're out of here. That would have been a course correction, or a course that could have been pursued but wasn't. Instead it was all servility toward the Taliban.
Yeah, Tom, we again ad nauseum we argued if we're going to leave, let's leave in a way that's responsible, not pull the tablecloth out from the set table, and those things, it's interesting. You pulled something out. I had forgot about this, but this is what he had said to Afghan leaders and military commanders, and who were concerned about the U.S. He had said, quote, "Don't worry until I tell you to worry," end quote. But then he never tells them to worry at any point at the time of the withdrawal.
From the transcript, it's not clear that he did, right? I mean, but maybe
I think he is actually asked about that later, and he says, "No, I never actually did say that to them." So they were strung along. This was something I was picking up at the very beginning when the withdrawal was announced. Afghan, when I talked to it was usually someone in the Interior Ministry or an ambassador or someone within the Afghan Ministry of Defense. No one believed it. It was for various reasons. Well, this person told me not to worry. This person told me the U.S. isn't really leaving. And he talks about that in the testimony. He confirms that as well. And I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing. But yeah, there was this sense, but I mean, to the bigger point, we never set the stage for the Afghans to really think that we were going to leave. It started, as you noted, under the Obama administration with attempts to negotiate with the Taliban. So, of course, 1 decade later, the Afghans are like, yeah, sure, the U.S. isn't going to really leave. They've been saying this for a decade now. Well, actually, it wasn't a decade. It would have been 7 years by the time the withdrawal was announced. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting point to his testimony.
And not only did we not convince them, that the U.S. not convince them that we were going to leave and make sure they understood we were leaving, the U.S. held them in this suspended animation in terms of the war fighting, where made the Afghans think that they were fighting for a draw, a mythical draw, that the Afghans themselves knew was not really a possibility. I mean, the Afghan government knew the Taliban really wasn't interested in that, or at least they should have known that. Maybe they didn't. I mean, Miller's testimony, kind of makes it think that the Afghans wanted a political settlement, a mythical political settlement as well. But the U.S. should have been realistic about that. You're not fighting for a draw, right? They're fighting for a win. So guess what? You better fight for a win as well. So not only did we not leave or convince the Afghans that we were going to leave, but yet we stayed there in a way that made our side fight for a draw that was an impossibility, while the other side was fighting to win. I mean, this is just totally nuts, right? This is really an insane way to fight a war, and to quote unquote manage a war, and this is what we're talking about here when it comes to accountability, right? Nobody has thought about this and said, wait a minute, this was all nuts, and maybe we shouldn't have done things this way. Maybe we should make sure we never do things this way again,
Yeah, but unfortunately, most of the same people who were in charge during Afghanistan are in charge of policy, and our involvement in Ukraine, and obviously with the involvement in the Middle East, and we're seeing a lot of the same problems with this, that we experienced in Afghanistan. And this is what you and I feared. I just didn't think, Tom, didn't think it would happen so soon. But here we are. Miller.
One other thing I was going to point out, and we can wrap up on this, but he's asked, General Miller's also asked about Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. Well, first of all, he's asked about Al Qaeda and ISIS, right? And he talks about ISIS being the greater threat. Now, when it comes to immediate international attacks, sure, right? ISIS is the greater threat. There's a lot of threat reporting on what ISIS was up to at the time of the withdrawal. There's a lot of reporting on ISIS's intent to up the ante after the U.S. leaves. I can understand from that perspective, and we've seen that play out when it comes to attacks inside Iran or Moscow or other plots elsewhere. You can see there are current threats that people are worried about even here in the U.S. from ISIS. Possibly having operations here, so you kind of understand that. The problem there is that wasn't the immediate threat to the Afghan government, or what was going to ultimately prevent us from having a counterterrorism posture, which General Miller and others recommended we needed to have, right? The greater threat there in terms of preventing the U.S. from actually having a counterterrorism posture or the Afghan government, or threat to the Afghan government, was from the Taliban Al-Qaeda axis, right? That's the bigger threat to that specific entity, the Afghan government, and to having some sort of posture in Afghanistan going forward. And General Miller's asked, he's read, one of the people who's questioning him reads this passage from a UN report. Basically, I'll just say, saying that Al Qaeda was marbled throughout the Taliban and was fighting to help, win the war, and senior Al Qaeda leadership was still there and all this other stuff. And General Miller says, yeah, that's big, and talks about AQIS, having camps and still operating throughout Afghanistan. And General Miller says, to his credit, that's what he saw the entire time, and it's not inconsistent with what he was seeing there. What's interesting, a couple things interesting about that. One, that assessment is different from a lot of what we read coming out of the Defense Department for years, which was downplaying the extent of Al-Qaeda's presence in Afghanistan, including through the withdrawal. Two, it's inconsistent with what Zalmay Khalilzad said when we last talked about this stuff in his testimony before House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he was saying that AQIS, that's Al-Qaeda in the subcontinent, was defeated and extinguished from Afghanistan and gone. No, right? There's no reason to think that. And Khalilzad likes to say, well, trust me, we have special assessments, better intelligence, what's going on. Well, no, here's the last general of the war, and he's saying that they were there the whole time, and so that's not true, And then, finally, however, Miller does offer a convoluted explanation of this. He says, that they were severely degraded, Al Qaeda was, even though that quote that he's read does not indicate that they were severely degraded, right?
Yeah.
But he couldn't tell if they were defeated. And I'm thinking to myself, well, this is Yamahama on this one. That quote makes it very clear that they were not defeated. So
and it's pretty much not even degraded, Tom. I mean,
it depends on how as you point out, Bill, they don't define degraded, right? So you don't know what they actually mean.
Yeah.
Is it an immediate threat to the U.S.? Okay, I can understand that argument, right? Or immediate threat internationally? Okay, I can understand that argument. But they don't really define it otherwise, and now you have all sorts of other assessments going around the U.S. intelligence community, which I'm sure are continuing this confusion, right? Which is another reason why this all needs to be plumbed, right? Because there is this ongoing confusion about all this stuff, and there are so many errors in the analysis, errors in the way people think about this stuff that have been on display in the war in Afghanistan. We've seen the consequences of these analytic errors with our own eyes, and yet there's not going to be any accountability or course correction on any of that stuff.
No, do not expect any accountability. Yeah, Tom, the hyper focus on ISIS at the expense and even cooperating with the Taliban to target ISIS. We were perplexed by this the entire time. And, Miller confirms that, right? He viewed ISIS as the greater threat, but ISIS was never going to take over Afghanistan. The Taliban, was on the brink of doing it. And it was done through negotiations as well as through military means. But he says that in the report. He kind of indicates the Taliban, did a soft takeover, but there were quite a bit of military operations by the Taliban through multiple provinces that facilitated the takeover. He's kind of in the middle on that one, actually. And let me take that back. But Khalilzad made it sound like the Taliban just sort of, just slowly, through influence, walked into Kabul. And it's interesting, right? You would probably have because let's face it, Khalilzad would probably outranked in the State Department, outranked the ambassador of the chargé d'affaires in Afghanistan. So you have your top political and top military leader who didn't see Afghanistan the same way. And you described that, right? With how they had two different views of what Al-Qaeda was, what their strength was, and what their relationship with the Taliban.
Yeah, and to be clear, I don't think any of them could actually describe it, right? That's the thing about it. It's like if you actually got into the specifics, they would be lost within 2 seconds. Other than Zawahiri being droned to death in his Victory Villa inside Kabul in 2022, nobody's gonna be able to articulate any other names, any other people, personalities, that kind of stuff, right? And that's the problem here. Is it just this sort of it doesn't. This whole situation didn't live in these people's minds the way it should have, in terms of who the enemy was and how the enemy was organized and what was going on. That's a big part of the lesson here. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's not just on General Miller, of course, or even just on Ambassador Khalilzad. It's on the whole U.S. government. It's on the commanders in chief. It's on principally. It's on a whole lot of people. But the thing is that there just were so few people saying the emperor is nude, and that's where this ultimately comes down and why it's so problematic.
Indeed, Tom. Hey, Tom, thanks for taking the time to join us on Generation Jihad. Always a pleasure.
No, pleasure's all mine. Trust me.
Let's do it again real soon, Tom. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more to talk about. You have a great day. Thanks, everyone, for listening to today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you can listen to us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Please subscribe to Generation Jihad and leave us a review, preferably a positive one, but only if we earned it. Thanks again, and we'll see you all again real soon.